Hello, and welcome to part one of the chapter on the gastrointestinal tract. This first part will cover just the normal anatomy and physiology. As always, the very beginning of the chapter, I'd like to super simplify the system that we're interested in. And let's talk about the function of the gastrointestinal tract. I will sometimes refer to this as the GI tract. If you think of it as any business, a hospital, a clinic, a university, there's a department that's known as the receiving department, basically gets the orders of materials that have been written out from different departments that need food, or they need IV bags, or they need sheets, or they, whatever is needed gets ordered and then brought in. And somebody's job it is to receive, absorb, get that stuff into the building. That is the GI tract. It's receiving all different kinds of materials, but it's in. And so some of the three main things that get received are water, really importantly, hugely important for the circulatory system and for the functioning of the respiratory system. For all of our systems, we have to have water, and that's the one way in. Then we're going to divide the other things that get received into macronutrients and micronutrients. It's a pretty arbitrary division, but it basically means macronutrients are the things that we receive in large quantities, large amounts. And we're going to break those down into four categories. The macronutrients, this is what's covered in that bonus review lecture. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that and you're not sure what these are, go ahead and take some time to watch that review lecture. So we're talking about the carbs, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. It's three of these, carbs, proteins, and lipids, that people usually think about when they talk about the macros in their diets. Excuse me. And these are the nutrients that are needed for a couple of different things. We use them for energy. You think about it in terms of the calories that they contain. We burn that stuff and we use the energy from that to make ATP, and we use ATP to pay for everything else. But the other thing that we use these items for is to actually build ourselves. The stuff that we are made out of is the stuff that we take in through our digestive system. And if you don't think that's weird, just think about your car for a moment. Imagine going to the gas station, and instead of putting gasoline in your tank, you just start funneling car parts into there and then say, buddy, you figure it out. I know you're going to need some of this, to get us to move along the road. And some of it you're going to need to rebuild yourself, change tires and do all the stuff that you need to do. But I know that you can take care of that. That is what our digestive system does, is figure out, okay, what do I need for fueling and what do I need to build stuff with? And it's the same material. Wow. Okay, and then the other stuff, micronutrients, these are things that we need in smaller amounts, not the huge honking amounts that we need the macronutrients in. And these include the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, magnesium, et cetera, et cetera. The minerals, we'll talk primarily about iron, but there are others, trace selenium, a bunch of different things that we need in tiny amounts. And then vitamins, these are multi-atom molecules. Some of them are lipid soluble, some of them are water soluble. We'll talk about a few examples. All right, so that's the big overview. That's what we're taking in, the gastrointestinal tract. Just a quick building it up again. If you haven't already and you don't know what these things are, carbs, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, and what they're made out of, go ahead and see the bonus lecture. All right, so let's quick review the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract and what we're talking about. It is one big, long, hollow tube. Starts at the mouth, ends at the anus. So it includes the mouth, the tube that connects from the mouth, the esophagus, going down to the stomach. Attached to the stomach is the small intestine, and it's called small because it's small in diameter. It's actually much longer than the large intestine. The small intestine is roughly broken into these three parts: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The way I remember it is DJs, people who play music, DJI. I don't know, I think of a logo, it's got an eyeball. It's stupid, but I remember it. So that's, it's not stupid if it helps me remember. All right, so DJI, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And different things get absorbed better in different parts of the small intestine. Okay, then what we call the large intestine is also known as the colon. There are different parts. We're not going to go over it in a huge amount of detail in this class, but there is, you've probably heard the terms ascending, transverse, and descending colon, and the sigmoid colon, and oh my gosh, which one's which, where's every. The easiest way to remember it is it's roughly shaped like a question mark. So I'm going to try to do this correctly for you. So ascending up across transverse, that's about where the belly button is, umbilicus. And then descending, question mark. And then the little squiggle part at the bottom, that's the sigmoid. And then when it straightens out, that's where we get to the rectum. This rect, where that comes from, is the Latin for straight, like erect, to erect something. So rectum is the straightaway at the end, and then the anus is where the sphincters are to control when we evacuate the rectum. All right, one big long tube. There are some accessory organs, there's accessory glands that kind of hang off the side of this big long tube, but it's the big long tube, that's the GI tract. Layered structure means there are different kinds of tissues. So there's an innermost epithelial layer, and then we go out from there, and we'll cover that. And then who tells the gastrointestinal tract what to do? Some coordination is enteric. That means it's within the gastrointestinal tract. There are neurons that belong just to the GI tract, and it's, I don't know how to describe it other than like internal memos, sending information from one part to the other, just of the GI tract. Don't need the brain or the spinal cord involved in any way. But we can make things go faster or slow things down with the autonomic nervous system, kind of like with the heart. It had that signaling pathway within the heart, but then we could, make it go faster and make it go slower. And then there are hormones and local mediators, that they're molecules that are being produced for signaling nearby, or actually some of it is even put into the bloodstream, but the targets are also part of the GI tract. And there are immune cells that play a role, and we'll cover all of this. And then physiology, it's all about moving things through. We have secretions that get added by glands, like the salivary glands, and organs, two notable ones, the liver, which we'll cover next week, and the pancreas, which we'll be covering today. So the different segments have different jobs. The first part of the GI tract is about like smashing things up, receiving in the mouth, chewing, pulverizing, mixing. And this is about getting some of the enzymes that need to access the molecules, mixing that stuff up so that the enzymes can get to the molecules that they need to get to. In the stomach, it's also very acidic in there. So there's some like antimicrobial action of this very low pH. And then we get to the small intestine. There's some more mixing for digestion and adding in some digestive enzymes. And then this is where we really start to absorb the nutrients. And so there's an insane amount of surface area, way more than you would predict on a little tube that's that thin. There's just a lot of ridges, and then within the ridges, there are more ridges. And then if you look even closer on the cells, there are ridges on the surfaces of the cells. It's just an insane amount of surface area for all this absorption that has to happen. Then we get to the large intestine, as we've said, also known as the colon. What's largely happening here is water reabsorption. We've gotten most of the nutrients that we can possibly get out of this slurry. We've already gotten them out, and now we just need to reclaim the water and some of the bile salt, some of the things that that we put into the food to mix it up and get it to move through the digestive system. Now we want that stuff back. And finally, the stool formation. And then the rectum and the anus are about sensing when the tank is full, and then going up and going ahead and opening up and allowing evacuation to happen, excretion to happen. The accessory structures, I've alluded to these already. So the GI tract is the hollow organ, the hollow tube that goes all the way through us. And in case this hasn't become clear, this hollow part, it's inside us, but it's not inside us. And I think I've used this analogy before. When you eat something, you get it into your digestive system, that's inside you, like it's in my belly, you know, but it's in the same sense that, you know, when you put your finger in the middle of a donut hole, your finger's in the donut, but it's not in the donut. So kind of like that. So the gastrointestinal tract is the hollow part. And then we've got these accessory structures. They're more solid and they kind of leak fluids into that hollow tube. And those include the salivary glands. There are some enzymes actually. So digestion actually starts in the mouth. And some of the enzymes are for digesting starch and for digesting fat molecules. Now, interestingly, there are no enzymes for digesting proteins, and that's not really an accident. I mean, because if you had it already in your mouth, you don't have a lot of protection here. And so the protein digestion will start like eating away at your tissues, which is not good. Okay, the next organ is the liver. We're going to cover it in chapter 14, so we'll go into it in some detail. But the part that we're going to mention here is that the liver produces bile that's absolutely required for being able to access the fat and help to digest the fat that we ingest. And then the third structure we'll mention is the pancreas. The pancreas, it's hard to see, but it's this kind of, I don't know, tongue-shaped structure. It's behind the stomach. We'll see a close-up, but it produces some fluids that get pumped into the very first part of the small intestine. So as things just come out of the stomach, the liver and the pancreas are already giving their contributions right there. And one of the most important things that the pancreas has to do is neutralize the acid that's coming out of the stomach. Because the stomach has a huge amount of mucus and has great protection against all of that acid, but the small intestine doesn't. And so we need to neutralize the acid. And that's what this bicarbonate-rich mucus is about, this bicarbonate-rich fluid. And then very importantly, and we'll get to this in more detail, are the digestive enzymes that are produced by the pancreas. Here, we're calling them proenzymes because they're not activated yet. Remember I said the reason we don't have proteases in the mouth, the enzymes to digest protein, is because it would start digesting the mouth. Same goes in the pancreas. Like we have these enzymes, they're going to be for breaking apart these molecules, but we don't want them activated yet until it hits the small intestine. Then, okay, then you can start digesting the stuff that's in there, but not before. Otherwise, they would start digesting the pancreas, which actually happens, as we will see later in this lecture. All right, here's that layered structure of the GI tract. I know I have it written from outside in over on the left, but take a quick look. From the inside, that's where the epithelial layers, this is where the absorption can start to happen. And then we've got different kinds of tissues going to the outside. So we'll follow this format here. The outer layer of this tube is referred to as the serosa. This is just like, remember around the lungs, we said there was this pleura, and around the heart, we said there was pericardium. Around the digestive tract, we have serosa. It's all the same stuff. It's all epithelial tissue. And it's there to secrete a little bit of fluid to have that easily movement without a lot of friction every time the digestive system moves, which it does. Why it's called different things in different places is different scientists studied them, and so they named them different things, but essentially we're talking about exactly the same kind of tissue. It's all epithelial tissue covering the surface, and then there's a parietal layer that's on the peritoneum. It's on the body wall, like on the inside of the abdominal muscles. And that's, you know, for the easy, smooth movement, so you don't have to scrape against the sides. Okay, then we've got a couple of muscle layers. Quick and dirty. You know those Chinese finger puzzles, at least that's what we used to call them when we were kids. We'd put our fingers in it and it would get real short and squat. And you'd put your fingers in and then you go to pull them out and then it would get narrow and then your fingers were stuck in there. That's kind of what these muscle layers are like. So there's an internal one that contracts this way, and that makes the lumen skinny and stretches the thing out. Then the outer layer, the muscles are arranged this way. And so when that contracts, this gets short and fat and open, and they take turns contracting. And that's how this thing changes shape and moves things around, and they coordinate movements so that you can get peristalsis to happen. Then we have the nerve plexuses. I can't say that word, plural of plexus. The internal nervous system, you know, for communication here of the digestive system. There's a submucosa with lots of glands, again, producing the mucus and producing the fluids that will help materials move along. And finally, we get to the innermost layer. That's the absorptive layer, the epithelial tissue that's going to be able to, like, once things are digested, pull those molecules in. Fantastic. All right, GI tract innervation. This is way more detail than we need, but I wanted to point out a few things here and then I'll simplify it on the next slide. So innervation, there's the enteric nervous system. These are the neurons that can communicate or create communication within the digestive system that can independently control motility, those muscle contractions that we were just talking about, as well as secretions from some of the glands. And they can act independent of the rest of the nervous system. But as we mentioned, there's parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation that can help speed things up or slow things down. It's parasympathetic, like always, along the vagus nerve. This last little bit, the sacral cord, this is kind of the end of the digestive system. So this is the part that controls, like, is it time to go poop now? And then sympathetic, let me go ahead and move to the next slide because there's less stuff on it and it's easier to concentrate. Oh no, I'm lying. This is a terrible diagram from our book. And I say terrible just because everything's abbreviated, so you don't know what anything stands for if you don't know what all the words are. But what I really want you to see is the autonomic nervous system has something to say to the GI tract. And we don't have to worry about what all the abbreviations stand for. What I want you to see is this X, that's the cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, telling the GI tract to do stuff. And then the sympathetic nervous system, and this is backwards from what we've said before. The parasympathetic is the excitatory system here, because we always say the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So rest we think of as just relax, but the digest part, that's what this organ system is about. This is when it gets to work. And then the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So you think of it as being very active, but when you're busy fighting and fleeing, you need your digestive system to chill. You do not need it to be digesting at that time. You know that blood flow to go elsewhere. And so this is why the what's excitatory and what's inhibitory, it seems to be backwards. So parasympathetic is excitatory. Sympathetic is inhibitory. If you need a way to think about this, if you think about when you've got some time off, you're not working, and you say, oh, I'm too tired, I don't want to cook, let's go out to eat. And so you're going to take a break and you're going to go to a restaurant. Well, there's a whole bunch of people at the restaurant that are not relaxing. They are busy. That's when they are working. That's when they're doing their job. And that's what the digestive system is about. So when it's parasympathetic, it's time to, quote, rest and digest. That is when the GI tract is the most excited. It's when it's doing the most, it's doing the most activity. And sympathetic, this is kind of rough, but if you've ever gotten really bad news, you may have had this experience where everything was okay, and then you got the very, very, very bad news. And I don't mean a little bit stressful, I mean like awful, just awful news. There are times when the sympathetic nervous system stimulation of the digestive system causes us to vomit. I mean, it just like, this is not the time to be digesting things. And the nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, basically evacuates the digestive system. Says, we are not going to be busy doing that right now. And if you have not had that experience, I'm very glad for you. Okay. A little more communication. This is hormonal control. I'm going to give you a few examples. So there's lots and lots of different hormones, lots and lots of different signals that happen to coordinate the different parts of the digestive system or the GI tract. So examples include, over here, I have the cell that makes the signal. Then in the next column, I put the name of the signal. What cells have receptors for that signal, in other words, the target cell, and then what effect this target cell expresses. All right, so in the stomach, there are some cells called G cells. They make something called gastrin. The targets for gastrin are other cells also in the stomach, but in a different place. These are parietal cells, and we've mentioned these before because we talked about intrinsic factor. Do you remember way back when we were talking about B12 and the effect the B12 has on making red blood cells? Okay, these are those cells, parietal cells. They make the intrinsic factor. They also make gastric acid, hydrochloric acid. And so when they receive the signal of gastrin, that means, okay, food's coming. I need some hydrochloric acid and I need some intrinsic factor. So make it and pump it out now. And the parietal cells respond. Then, as things are moving along, let's see, some things got mushed around in the stomach and then passed along into the small intestine. There are some cells of the small intestine that detect that food has arrived, especially they detect food, including fatty food, has arrived, and they produce something called cholecystokinin. You know, we're going to be communicating with the liver and the gallbladder. Kinin activation, remember that kinetic? So CCK, the target cells here, so the cells that have receptors for for this signal are in the gallbladder and in the pancreas. What are they going to do? Well, the gallbladder is going to start contracting to push out some of the bile, to push it into the small intestine. And the pancreas is going to do a similar thing. It's going to secrete some digestive enzymes. These haven't been activated yet, but they'll get activated once they get into the small intestine. But wait, there's more. Then as the food, as the chyme, this mixture that comes from the stomach, as that moves along the small intestine, it eventually arrives at the last part of the small intestine, the ileum. And some of the cells in the ileum produce GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide. And this one, now we're going to communicate backwards. We're going to communicate back to the stomach, and we're going to communicate forward to the pancreas. See if this makes sense. So the GLP-1, the stomach cells, when they get that signal, they're being told, chill, decrease motility. You don't have to work so hard anymore. The food's already out of there and already down here. And then the pancreas cells, where before we were talking about the exocrine cells of the pancreas that make the digestive enzymes, now we're going to talk about the endocrine cells of the pancreas that will secrete insulin into the bloodstream for dealing with the carbohydrates, the sugars that might start showing up in the blood. All right, so I think about it this way. The ileum is basically saying, look, these back with the restaurant analogy. All right, these people are done with their meal, so you can start cleaning up the dining room. You can clear the table, but we need the cashier because they're going to want to pay and they're going to want to get ready to go. So backwards planning, like clean up the stuff that was happening before, and then what's going to be happening next. We're going to have to prepare for that too. So this is what I mean by there's coordination of all these different parts in the GI tract. It's just beautiful. Okay, so some more signaling, and this actually has a significance for our patients every day. The enteric nervous system, we've mentioned this, it's communication here in the GI tract. It has opioid peptides and receptors for these opioid peptides. And when they get stimulated, that slows things down, reduced motility. Well, the consequence this has that's of nursing significance is constipation, the slowing down of movement of the digestive system. That's an enormously important side effect when we treat with opioid analgesics. So when patients are receiving opioids, everything slows down and it's harder for them to have a bowel movement because everything is slowing down. And then we can use this to our advantage, because if our patient has the problem, they might not be in pain, but they just have diarrhea, we can give them opioids or opioid analogs. We don't want to get them high, but we want to take advantage of that slow everything down part of this. Like, for example, loperamide. It's not going to cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're not going to get high from it, but it can tell the digestive system, slow down. We need to reabsorb some water before you just keep dumping things out of the anus. Very clever. Okay, a little bit more about immune activity. So the immune system involvement already starts in the mouth. Now think about this. I've said this is on still the outside of the body, if you will. Even if it goes inside the mouth and in the esophagus and in the stomach, we know that we're bringing in things from the outside, and there's the possibility of getting some microorganisms or some toxins or something that's not supposed to be there. And so we have some immunoglobulins waiting. And you might remember IgGs and IgMs, those were important in the bloodstream, but IgAs, aqueous, he said those were in the solutions and the secretions. So IgA is largely what the immunoglobulin that you find in the GI tract. It starts as early as the saliva, but it goes throughout the GI tract all the way through to the end. Okay, and then there's more immune system involvement in the small and large intestines, as we'll see in a moment. So here's the small intestine immune components. We have, how to describe it? There's the possibility of having some microorganisms in the small intestine. There's not nearly as much in the small intestine as in the large, but you still have some microbes in here. And so we have these areas where there's a lot of gut immune activity. They're called Peyer's patches. You may have heard of them referred to as gut-associated lymphatic tissue, GALT, G-A-L-T, gut-associated lymphatic tissues. And so Peyer's patches, this is the other name for them. And continuing on in the colon, in the large intestine, in other words, that's where the majority of our microorganisms are. We refer to it as the microbiota. It's just a fancy way of saying all the microbes that are commensal, that either don't harm us or are actually beneficial to us and contribute to digestion. And we have immune function and immune tolerance. We're not trying to kill these microbes all the time, in other words. But we do have lymphocytes, part of the adaptive immunity, and macrophages, part of the innate immunity, cruising around just in case, because we know there's a lot of microbes in here. And it's just to make sure things, make sure that the microbes continue to behave. And that is the end of part 1. See you in part 2.